Today we're going to be looking at the colonial era, which was from 1620 to 1763. Now, there are several concepts or definitions that I want you to know before we go into the whole colonial era in North America. First, the concept is mercantilism. Our definition is practice of creating and maintaining wealth by carefully controlling trade as in countries using colonies for financial resources. For example, England settled the 13 colonies, and the 13 colonies had what was called cash crops. So cash crops are tobacco, cotton, indigo that made a lot of money from England. So England forced those colonies to constantly export their goods to them and sell the goods to them, and they could only buy goods from England. That way ensure that England was making a lot of money from their colonies. If you look at solitary neglect, like I said, England settled or were over the 13 colonies in North America. That's why we speak English, because English comes from England. Although they settled the area, they really did not rule over us directly. Let us create our own different types of government. So that's called solitary neglect. Unofficially British policy in the 17th and 18th centuries of loosely enforcing laws in the colonies. Keep in mind, they're on the other side of the world. We're in North America, they're in Europe, so they did let us rule by ourselves. Trade is going to start, and this trade system is going to be called the triangular slave, the triangular slave trade. It was a pattern of colonial trade in which slaves were brought in Africa with New World rum, which is alcohol, and then traded in the West Indies for sugar or molasses, which was brought back to New England to be manufactured. So it's called the triangle because if you look, here's the New World, which would be North and South America. Here's Europe, and then Africa is at the bottom, and it makes a triangle. If you look at the 13 colonies, they were grouped into three categories. You're going to have New England, Middle, and Southern colonies. North Carolina is actually part of the 13 colonies, and we're in the Southern colony category. The inhabitants, or the people of each region, lived very different lives. And then each colony had its different way that it was founded. So your proprietary colony was given to a single person or group by the British Crown with permission to govern the colony. Excuse me. Your royal colony will be run by the king and officials appointed by the king. Although they're assigning people this land in the New World, keep in mind Native Americans still live there. And they are disregarding their land ownership. So let's look at the categories. You're going to have the first, like I said, is New England, and that's made up of Rhode Island, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, and Connecticut. They were originally settled by Puritans at Plymouth, which is, you have the Pilgrims. So a lot of these colonies were founded for religious reasons. The New England colony is basically another group of Puritans settled Massachusetts Bay Colony with its first major city at Boston. If you notice, if you look at football, you have the New England Patriots. That's why they're called New England Patriots, because Massachusetts is part of this category of colonies. So that's why I said themselves calling them the Massachusetts Patriots. They call themselves the New England Patriots because of the history of that area. Connecticut was settled in 1636 by men looking for more religious freedom than was allowed in Massachusetts because the Puritans were very strict. Rhode Island was founded in 1636 also, but it was founded by Roger Williams. He was also looking for religious freedoms. New Hampshire was founded in 1691, and it was settled by farmers. Economically, these colonies were limited by rough land. They focused on fishing and whaling of furs, because it is up north, lumber, shipping and trading with England, especially in Boston. They did it through the Boston Harbor. Now the middle colonies, which is made up of New York, Pennsylvania, Delaware, and New Jersey, New York was taken over from the Dutch in 1674. New Jersey was also taken from the Dutch. It served as a proprietary colony and later a royal colony. The biggest proprietary colony was Pennsylvania. Its land was given to William Penn by King Charles II in 1681, hence the state name Pennsylvania. Penn was a Quaker, which is a religious group that I'll go more in detail in class. Delaware was once part of Pennsylvania, but it eventually independently governed itself. Economically, the land was better than New England. The economy was a mix of agriculture, which made up mainly of wheat, and trade. They were trading with other people to make money. Trade flourished in cities like New York and Philadelphia. The last category, you have your southern colonies, which is made up of Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. Virginia started with the Lost Colony, the Roanoke Colony, which we talked about, and eventually Jamestown in 1607. So the first successful colony in the New World will be Jamestown, and that's in 1607. The southern colonies, Virginia relied heavily on the cash crop of tobacco and developed a social structure that included large plantation owners. At the top, with owners of smaller farms, servants, and slaves below. Carolina was founded in 1629 as a single proprietary colony. North Carolina will eventually split into two colonies. That's where you will get North Carolina and South Carolina. South Carolina will cultivate the cash crops of rice and indigo. North Carolina, we also made tobacco a cash crop in our state. Its biggest city, Charleston in South Carolina, became a thriving trade city and the only city that could rival the great trade centers of the North. You can go visit Charleston now. It's a lot of historical sites. Georgia was also a proprietary colony. Its creator, James Oglethorpe, wanted a colony where the poor of England could get a new start. The colony failed, and it was eventually turned over to the crown as a royal colony. Georgia was also a buffer state because Spain is going to settle Florida, will colonize Florida. So Georgia is also going to have like a military base there too to keep us as a buffer state, because you have England and then Spain. Economically, the southern colonies had long growing seasons and fertile soil along the Atlantic coastal plain. They had mainly an agriculture economy, which, because they had all the cash crops, indigo, cotton, rice, tobacco was grown. They had a lack of large cities like the North. If you look today, even now, the North has bigger cities than the South does. The largest farms called plantations. So slave labor used to harvest all these cash crops. So that's why the slave population grew so much more in the southern colonies, because of their economic needs of having all these different cash crops and all these different, basically farmland. So there was more slaves in the South than it was in the North. Going forward, all the colonies were being successful, but you're going to have a French and Indian War takes place between 1754 to 1763. It was a part of a larger global war known as the 7 Years' War. So you'll sometimes hear 7 Years' War, or you'll hear the French-Indian War. It pitted France, the French colonists, and their Native American allies against Britain colonists and their Native American allies. So the Native Americans fought on either side. Basically, Native Americans was hoping that these European countries would defeat each other and they would get their land back, and eventually they will leave. As you see, present day, the Europeans never left. Two sides fought for possessions in North America. The battle itself, the British lost several battles early in the conflict against France. However, George Washington, which will later become our first president, he served for the British during those defeats as a lieutenant colonel. The British would eventually gain the upper hand in the war in the final years of 1750s. So France allied itself with Spain, but it wasn't enough. Britain would get its victory, but it would come at a cost, and we'll talk about that why it would come to a cost. So what was the result? The Treaty of Paris was signed in 1763. It expands the British Empire. The huge cost of the war leads to British government attempting to impose taxes on the colonies, which will eventually lead to the American Revolution. So let's review everything we talked about in this lecture video. Mercantilism guided the relationship between British and her colonies. Basically, Britain will just use especially the southern colonies for their cash crops to bring more money to Britain. Solitary neglect allowed the colonies to develop with less influence from Britain. It also allowed the colonies to ignore British laws because Britain wasn't very hands-on with governing them because they were on the other side of the world. The triangular slave trade was a series of trade routes between regions. The Middle Passage was the leg of the trade in which slaves were brought to the Americas from Africa. It was a horrible journey for them. They stayed below deck on a ship for 3 to 4 months going from Africa to the New World. They were mistreated. They were not bathed. It was just a horrible voyage. The 13 colonies are grouped into 3 regions. You have New England, Middle, and Southern colonies. The regions were very different, and colonies within each region different from each other. Great Britain won the French and Indian War, but was costly. Britain attempted to tax its colonists to pay for the war, which is going to eventually lead to the American Revolution. And that's all for today. Thank you and have a good day.